What are your quick thoughts on just like venture debt for fintechs? Because it's a challenging thing on the lending side. If you want to become a lender and you're a startup, and then you have to get, quickly think of like James Sagan over at Architect, who's an LP in our fund. And he's been, doing some early lending out to fintechs. But how are those fintechs that are looking at lending, how are they taking on debt, and what have you seen kind of be the effective mechanism to kick that off early on?
hmm Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that that's probably an area where I think we could still see more venture debt in Latin America. I don't think there's enough of that type of capital for lending businesses, for lending startups. But I think there are options, and I definitely think that it's important to sort of find ways to gain traction early on, as you validate your hypotheses and your business models, and getting access to venture debt is definitely one way to do that, right? To start validating, even if you don't have sort of the ideal terms from the start. I think it's more important to, or the ideal sort of, or if it's an expensive sort of source of debt, I think it's more important to sort of align on terms and being able to gain traction, to start validating those hypotheses, and then you can always sort of refinance and get access to different type of debt. So I think there are options, and we've worked with a few funds that do debt and that work with our startups, because we have sort of historically funded a lot of lending businesses, of course. And so I think it's a great option. But I would say that I still think in Latin America, especially local debt, is still very limited to entrepreneurs. No.
Yeah, and it seems pretty early in its cycle, but
Yeah.
something critical for kind of building a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah.
Speaking of just, is every company really going to become a fintech? What's your perspective there? For embedded finance, is it better to build or partner up?
Yeah, yeah. I think embedded finance is becoming one of those terms that is probably overused at this point, but I still think it's an important one, and one that as I think about Fontes in particular, one that I'm excited to see more of. And you alluded to Quintandar, right? Like that's an example of embedded finance. We see Kavak, we see Loft, Nuvo Cargo. There's a ton of these types of businesses, and I think that in Latin America specifically, it makes a ton of sense, especially as you think about, whether you're building, even if your business doesn't start in the financial services space, oftentimes, especially as you build out, whether it's a marketplace, or a business that sort of captures customer data, as you think about what you are trying to achieve in the long term, oftentimes there is a space for you to actually provide financial services to your customers, especially given the dynamics we talked about in the beginning, where customers sort of don't really trust existing financial institutions and are looking for other ways to either bank or get finance, et cetera. There's actually a space for companies where they have different type of brand loyalty or a different type of product to become, the bank, or to become the source of capital for these customers. And if you look at some of the bigger, companies that have been built, Quinton, that is a great example, right? The way that they probably didn't start out thinking about financing, but as you start building out sort of the big ambitious vision, you realize that you actually need to build, all 7 steps of the value chain instead of just one, because just one doesn't make sense if the rest of the value chain is broken. So I think in places where there's still so much to build, like Latin America, it makes a lot of sense to have these platform type businesses, and models where one of those steps ends up being fintech, likely, or financial services. So I don't think that every company will be a fintech. I do think that every company could be a fintech, and where it makes sense, and especially in Latin America, I think that's going to start to make a lot of sense, where banking and financial services essentially becomes sort of less consolidated and more distributed into different types of businesses, because that's where the customer loyalty lies, or that's where the data lies, that will allow you to actually build out better products, services, and experiences for your customer. So I'm excited to sort of meet more companies in that space, and to see, because I still see a lot of verticals where there are no big players that have built this, and so I think there's still a lot that can be done there.